Welcome to the Common Assessment Rating Training for the Davis School District's World Languages Common Assessment. Given twice a year, the Common Assessment is an assessment of learning that can motivate students with proof of their success. Common assessments also tell us whether we've reached our goals. This language acquisition grid may be something that you actually have hanging in your classroom. We created this poster for our teachers and our students' use. The visual helps us understand the language acquisition timeline. It's also a roadmap for our students. We'll be using many of these terms as we go over how to rate our assessments. If you've taken the proficiency training, you've heard lots of words like functions, context, content, vocabulary, accuracy, language control, but we're going to focus mostly on text type as we look over our students' assessments and come up with a rating. Text type is the main determiner of the proficiency level students have. More about this later. This is our writing performance rubric. We've recently adjusted it. It'd be a great idea for you to go over this rubric with your students before the assessment, and in fact many times throughout the year, so students understand what's expected of them and where they're going. It's like a roadmap for language acquisition. Showing the students the rubric also helps them to understand that we're not looking for perfection. And in fact, perfection isn't something that we even grade on. You don't want to spend a lot of time on novice low because so few of your students will be in this area. Most students in a proficiency-based classroom will leave novice low in 2 or 3 weeks of class. But roughly, novice low is 20 words or less in their vocabulary, and maybe a formula, possibly two, that they can use, something like I like, and they say it over and over again, like I like football because it's fun, I like to play football with my friends, I like oranges, I like chocolate. You just see the same formula with different words plugged in, but really, really basic. You won't see many of your students here in the novice low range. You can familiarize yourself with these things up here better, but you can see that it says they're barely hanging on to novice functions and structures. So they barely are able to make sentences. There's a lot of listing, a lot of single words, and lots of mistakes. The majority of your level 1 students will be firmly in the novice mid-range by this time of the year. Novice mid is our goal for all level 1 students. Notice that our rubric has further divided it into 3 areas, C, P, and F, for conceptual control, meaning they got formulas and they know how to use them, and they've even got several that they can use, but their ability to control that language is so bad that we kind of only think they have the general idea of what they're supposed to be doing. So we say conceptual control. The P stands for partial control, meaning the students can do words and lists and memorize phrases, but they don't have complete control over it. They're still making lots of errors. So partial control. When they get to the stage where they're going to have a score of 4, their entire paper is mostly formulas, maybe a few created thrown in, but not enough to push them up into novice high. And they have so few errors. In fact, some students can be so good at formulas that they never want to leave and go up into the other range because they don't like to make mistakes. That's why we've got to be really careful that we don't award students or reward students for being perfect. We want to encourage them to make mistakes because it's only when they make mistakes that they'll be able to leave this full control of novice mid and go up to the next level required in level 2. So conceptual control of novice mid, partial control of novice mid, or full control of novice mid. Then you'll determine whether they have a 2, 3, or a 4. Chantal Thompson, the proficiency guru at BYU who comes and does our trainings for us in the summer, has named a novice mid student a parrot. And this parrot might say, I'm a novice mid speaker. I can talk about things using words, lists, and memorized phrases. I may create 1 or 2 sentences of my own, and if I'm asked questions, I typically respond with just 2 or 3 words, or using a stock phrase that I've memorized. I pause a lot to find the right word. I'm a parrot. This red range is Novice High. This is where we expect our students to be at the end of Level 2. It differs from Novice Mid because students can now create their own sentences at least half the time when it's required. It's not always required in our prompts. Almost every prompt we create starts with telling the students to introduce themselves. Introducing yourself is something that almost always uses formulas. In fact, if I were to run into you on the street and say, "Hi, how are you?" and you reply back, our entire conversation in that introduction, "Hi, how are you?" thing would be in formulas. So when your student introduces themselves at the first of their written prompt, their written assessment, you would expect to see formulas. So we wouldn't be looking for 50% in that area, but the rest of the paper, if they can create with the language 50% of the time or more, they're probably in the Novice High range. But beware. Once they start to create with the language, it's like a baby who's starting to walk. They are going to fall a lot. They make all kinds of errors. So it's very normal for a student who was doing beautiful writing at Novice Mid-range to move up to Novice High and start to make all sorts of ugly errors. Completely normal and something to be celebrated. I like to use Goofy as my little mascot for the Novice High range because I think of him in this picture as the faller. The Novice High student falls back to formulaic speech when they can't create with the language for what the idea they'd like to express is. So Goofy might say, "I'm a Novice High speaker. I can talk about these topics and other general topics about myself using formulas and created sentences at least half the time. I can answer simple, direct questions, and I'm also able to ask a few formulaic questions. I make lots of errors. Some native speakers can understand me. I'm still a parrot often." And finally, we're going to move on to Intermediate Low. The big difference between Novice High and Intermediate Low, and those two areas are very closely linked, is that a Novice High speaker can create with the language 50% of the time or more, whereas now an Intermediate Low speaker can create with the language all of the time that it is expected of them to. Again, remember that in an introduction of a paper or the ending of a letter or whatever they're doing, there's often times when formulaic speech is the best speech, but every other time they can create with the language 100%. Again, Chantal Thompson tells us that these guys would call themselves, or we could call them, survivors. They can go into a new situation, create new sentences, and survive on the language that they can produce. It doesn't have to fit into a formula that they've already memorized. They're survivors now. This little guy might say, "I'm an Intermediate Low speaker. I can create my own sentences and ask questions on familiar concrete topics like those needed for survival. Almost everything I say is in the present tense, but not all. I make many errors since I'm not using as many memorized sentences as I used to. In fact, sometimes I don't use hardly any at all." If a native speaker is used to hearing foreigners like me, they can understand me. I'm a survivor. Now let's go back and look at each one of these three guys, the parrot, the faller, and the survivor. Again, remember, we're going to focus mostly on text type. The parrot's text type, in bold and underlined, is words, lists, phrases, and occasional sentences, meaning a sentence that they've created. The text type for the faller, or the Novice High student, are phrases, those are memorized, and simple sentences, those are ones that they've created. And they can create original sentences and do it at least half the time. That's the big differential there. When we get up to the text type for these guys in the Intermediate Low, we see strings of simple sentences that they've created. So it might be sentences and strings of simple sentences that they've created. They can create original sentences and maintain it 100% of the time. Now let's go farther. Once you look at that, that they're using words, lists, phrases, and occasional sentences in the novice thing. You can also see that they use limited number of words and their repetitive words and phrases for common things that they talk about a lot in class. Now, when you're determining whether they're a 2, 3, or a 4, you need to look over here. Can they only be understood with difficulty by someone accustomed to the language, or are they getting more and more control? So do they have conceptual control, partial control, or full control? And comprehensibility will be the thing that helps you determine that. Makes few errors, like with their grammar, word choice, punctuation, and spelling, as they get full control. They will have, as they get towards full control, they'll have fewer and fewer of these errors. And then errors often prevent communication. That is true for the novice speaker, but as they get more control or full control, as we're moving up into the higher score range of the 4, that'll get even better. So first of all, determine what text type they're using. Then look at the other areas to determine if they have conceptual, partial, or full control. This little Goofy the Faller, he can mostly be understood by someone who is accustomed to the language, who's accustomed to language learners. He makes few errors in grammar, word choice, and punctuation and spelling when he's using practice topics, but when he's creating original sentences, errors will sometimes prevent communication. You'll look at their sentences and wondering what the heck they're trying to say. That's why it's sometimes nice to have a friend or a colleague with you when you're rating because you can look at and say, what are they trying to say? And you can often help each other figure it out, because really, as they get up into these areas, the novice, high, intermediate, low range, they can get pretty messy. Then in the intermediate low, they can be understood. It's different. Not can mostly be understood, but they can be understood by someone accustomed to language learners. They still make some errors, but they have good control of their grammar, word choice, punctuation, or spelling on practice topics, as well as some original sentences. But their errors don't usually prevent communication. So notice here, their errors can sometimes prevent communication. Here, they don't usually prevent communication, so that's another difference. So please take your time to go over the rubric, read through the different words, looking at the subtle differences such as errors often prevent communication, errors sometimes prevent communication, and errors don't prevent communication. And that'll help you determine, after you've looked at text type, where your students are on the grid. I hope this helps you just a little bit as you go through and you see how important this rubric is for rating these assessments. Again, it's always best to rate in a group with your department or with a colleague or with us in the district offices. We do the district office ratings after every common assessment, and we're here to help everyone get them done and be on your way for a fun summer. So I hope this helps. Feel free to call me or text me or email me if you have any questions. Happy assessment!